The prison cell was cold and silent on the morning of September 1st, 1967. Guards at Aichach Women's Prison in Bavaria made their routine rounds, unaware that behind one particular door, a chapter of history's darkest period was about to close forever. The woman inside had once wielded absolute power over thousands of lives, earning herself a reputation that would haunt the world long after the Third Reich fell to ruins. Ilse Koch, known as the Witch of Buchenwald, had spent her final years behind bars, her notoriety following her even into imprisonment. But the events leading to this moment, and the complex web of crimes, trials, and controversies that defined her path, reveal a story far more intricate than most realize. What drove a woman to become one of history's most feared perpetrators? How did someone who began as a bookkeeper's wife transform into a symbol of Nazi brutality? And what really happened in those final moments that brought her story to its ultimate conclusion? Ilse Koch was born in Dresden in 1906, the daughter of a factory worker. Nothing in her early years suggested the path her life would take. She worked as a bookkeeper and librarian before meeting Karl Otto Koch in 1936, a rising SS officer who would become commandant of several concentration camps. Their marriage in 1937 marked the beginning of Ilse's transformation from ordinary citizen to willing participant in the Nazi machinery of terror. When Karl Koch was appointed commandant of Buchenwald concentration camp in 1937, Ilse accompanied him, establishing herself not merely as the commandant's wife, but as an active participant in camp operations. Buchenwald, located near Weimar in central Germany, became operational in July 1937. Initially designed to house political prisoners, it rapidly expanded to include Jews, Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses, and other groups targeted by the Nazi regime. By the time of Ilse Koch's arrival, the camp was already a place of systematic dehumanization and violence. What set Ilse Koch apart from other wives of Nazi officials was her direct involvement in camp activities. Unlike many who remained willfully ignorant of their husband's work, Koch actively participated in the daily operations of Buchenwald. She established herself as a figure of authority among both guards and prisoners, using her position to exercise power over the lives of thousands. Witnesses later testified that Koch would ride through the camp on horseback, selecting prisoners for punishment based on arbitrary criteria. Her presence became associated with fear among the imprisoned population, who learned to avoid drawing her attention at all costs. The extent of her involvement became clear through prisoner testimonies gathered after the war. Former inmates described how Koch would inspect prisoners during roll call, pointing out those she deemed unfit or problematic. These selections often resulted in severe punishment or transfer to worse conditions within the camp system. But perhaps most disturbing was Koch's alleged involvement in the systematic exploitation of prisoners for personal gain. Testimony emerged suggesting she had ordered the creation of items made from human remains, including lampshades, book covers, and gloves. While some of these claims would later be disputed, the testimonies painted a picture of someone who had completely abandoned human decency. The power Koch wielded at Buchenwald extended beyond simple cruelty. She allegedly maintained relationships with prisoners who could provide her with luxury items and information, creating a network of informants and collaborators who helped maintain her position of authority. As the war progressed and conditions at Buchenwald deteriorated, Koch's reputation for brutality only grew stronger. Prisoners who survived their time at the camp would later describe her as someone who seemed to derive pleasure from the suffering of others, making her complicit in the systematic dehumanization that defined the concentration camp system. Her transformation from bookkeeper to perpetrator raises uncomfortable questions about how ordinary people can become complicit in systematic violence. Koch's case demonstrates how institutional power, combined with ideological indoctrination, can lead individuals to participate in acts they might never have imagined possible. But the full extent of her crimes was yet to be revealed, and the path that led her from the heights of Nazi power to a prison cell was filled with twists that few could have predicted. The beginning of Ilse Koch's downfall came not from Allied forces, but from within the Nazi hierarchy itself. In 1941, her husband, Karl Koch, was arrested by SS investigators on charges of corruption and unauthorized executions. The charges were serious enough that even by Nazi standards, his actions were considered excessive and problematic. Karl Koch had been skimming money from the camp's operations and had ordered the execution of prisoners who might have exposed his corruption. The SS, despite its involvement in systematic violence, maintained strict protocols about unauthorized killings and financial impropriety. Karl's actions violated these internal rules, making him a liability to the organization. During the investigation into her husband's activities, Ilse Koch's own conduct came under scrutiny. SS investigators documented her involvement in camp operations and began questioning prisoners about her behavior. The testimonies they collected painted a disturbing picture of abuse and exploitation that went beyond what even some Nazi officials were willing to overlook. Karl Koch was executed by the SS in April 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender. His death marked the end of Ilse's position of power at Buchenwald, but it also began a new chapter in her story, one that would see her face justice for her actions. When American forces liberated Buchenwald on April 11, 1945, they found evidence of systematic murder, medical experiments, and other atrocities. Among the evidence were items allegedly made from human remains, some of which were linked to Ilse Koch's orders. The liberating soldiers were shocked by what they discovered, and their reports helped bring international attention to the scale of Nazi crimes. Ilse Koch was arrested by American forces in June 1945. Initially held at various detention facilities, she was eventually transferred to await trial as part of the broader effort to prosecute war criminals. The evidence against her was substantial, collected not only from Allied investigations, but also from testimony by hundreds of camp survivors. The Allied authorities faced a challenge in prosecuting Koch and other Nazi officials. The scale of the crimes was unprecedented, and legal frameworks had to be adapted to address acts that had never before been systematically prosecuted. Koch's case became part of a larger effort to establish legal precedents for crimes against humanity. During her imprisonment awaiting trial, Koch maintained her innocence of the most serious charges. She acknowledged her presence at Buchenwald, but denied participating in the systematic violence and exploitation that witnesses described. Her defense strategy focused on portraying herself as merely a bystander to her husband's activities. However, the testimony of survivors painted a different picture. Former prisoners provided detailed accounts of Koch's direct involvement in selections, punishments, and the exploitation of prisoners for personal gain. Their testimonies, given under oath, provided prosecutors with a clear picture of her role in the camp's operations. The evidence against Koch included not only witness testimony, but also physical evidence found at Buchenwald. Allied investigators had documented items allegedly made from human remains, though the exact extent of Koch's involvement in their creation would become a point of controversy in later years. As her trial approached, Koch's case attracted significant media attention. The idea of a woman actively participating in such systematic violence challenged contemporary understanding of gender roles and complicity. Her case became symbolic of how the Nazi system had corrupted individuals at every level of society. The legal proceedings that followed would test the newly established frameworks for prosecuting crimes against humanity, while also revealing the complexities of assigning individual responsibility within a system of institutionalized violence. Ilse Koch's first trial began in 1947, before an American military tribunal at Dachau. The proceedings were part of a broader effort to prosecute war criminals and establish accountability for Nazi crimes. Koch faced charges including violations of the laws and customs of war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The prosecution's case relied heavily on testimony from Buchenwald survivors. Former prisoners took the stand to describe their experiences under Koch's authority, providing detailed accounts of her behavior and actions. Their testimonies painted a consistent picture of someone who had actively participated in the camp's systematic violence. One particularly damaging piece of testimony came from a former prisoner who described how Koch had ordered the creation of items from human remains. The witness testified that Koch had specifically requested these items and had displayed them in her residence. While the exact details would later be disputed, the testimony established a pattern of dehumanization and exploitation. Another witness described Koch's involvement in prisoner selections during roll call. According to this testimony, Koch would point out prisoners she deemed problematic or unfit, leading to their punishment or transfer to worse conditions. The witness described these selections as arbitrary and cruel, based more on Koch's whims than any legitimate camp regulations. The defense attempted to portray Koch as a victim of circumstances, arguing that she had been forced to live at Buchenwald due to her husband's position and had not actively participated in camp operations. Her lawyers argued that witness testimonies were unreliable due to the traumatic experiences of the survivors and their desire for revenge. However, The prosecution countered with evidence of Koch's voluntary participation in camp activities. They presented testimony showing that she had chosen to involve herself in camp operations when she could have remained in the background. Her active participation in selections and her alleged orders for items made from human remains demonstrated a level of engagement that went beyond mere presence. The trial revealed disturbing details about daily life at Buchenwald under the Koch's authority. Witnesses described a system where arbitrary violence was commonplace and where prisoners lived in constant fear of selection for punishment, or worse. Koch's role in maintaining this atmosphere of terror became a central focus of the proceedings. Physical evidence presented at the trial included photographs and documents from Buchenwald, as well as items allegedly created under Koch's orders. While some of this evidence would later be questioned, it provided a tangible connection between Koch and the systematic exploitation of prisoners. The prosecution also presented evidence of Koch's financial corruption, showing how she had used her position to accumulate wealth through the exploitation of prisoner labor and camp resources. This evidence demonstrated that her participation in camp operations was motivated not only by ideology, but also by personal gain. In August 1947, the military tribunal found Koch guilty of war crimes and sentenced her to life imprisonment. The verdict was based on the overwhelming evidence of her participation in the systematic violence and exploitation at Buchenwald. However, this would not be the end of her legal proceedings. In 1948, the sentence was reduced to 4 years by General Lucius Clay, the American military governor of Germany. Clay's decision was controversial and based partly on questions about the reliability of some evidence, particularly regarding the items allegedly made from human remains. The reduction sparked outrage among survivors and their advocates. Koch was released from prison in 1951, having served her reduced sentence. However, her freedom would be short-lived, as German authorities were preparing to pursue their own charges against her for crimes committed against German citizens at Buchenwald. The American proceedings had established important legal precedents, but they had also revealed the challenges of prosecuting such unprecedented crimes. The complexity of determining individual responsibility within a system of institutionalized violence would continue to influence how Koch's case was handled. Koch's release in 1951 sparked immediate controversy and calls for further prosecution. German authorities, under pressure from survivors groups and international opinion, began preparing charges against her for crimes committed against German citizens at Buchenwald. The German legal system now had the opportunity to address crimes that had been committed on German soil against German nationals. The German investigation revealed additional evidence of Koch's activities that had not been fully explored in the American proceedings. Investigators interviewed more survivors and examined records that had become available since the end of the war. This new evidence painted an even more detailed picture of Koch's role in Buchenwald's operations. In 1951, Koch was arrested again, this time by German authorities. The charges included murder, attempted murder, and other crimes committed against prisoners at Buchenwald. The German proceedings would prove to be more thorough than the American trial, with access to additional witnesses and evidence. The second trial began in 1950 and continued into 1951. German prosecutors presented evidence showing that Koch had been directly responsible for the deaths of numerous prisoners. They argued that her actions went beyond simple compliance with orders and demonstrated a pattern of sadistic behavior that resulted in unnecessary suffering and death. Witness testimony in the German trial provided new details about Koch's behavior. Former prisoners described specific incidents where Koch had ordered punishments that resulted in prisoner deaths. These testimonies were particularly powerful because they came from German citizens who had been imprisoned at Buchenwald for political reasons. One significant piece of evidence was testimony about Koch's alleged involvement in medical experiments conducted on prisoners. While she was not a medical professional, witnesses testified that she had facilitated and observed experiments that resulted in prisoner deaths. This evidence demonstrated her complicity in some of Buchenwald's most horrific crimes. The German court also examined evidence of Koch's financial exploitation of prisoners. Testimony revealed that she had forced prisoners to create luxury items for her personal use and had sold prisoner-made goods for personal profit. This evidence showed that her participation in camp operations was motivated by greed as well as ideology. Defense attorneys again attempted to minimize Koch's role, arguing that she had been following her husband's orders and had not acted independently. However, the evidence presented in the German trial clearly showed instances where Koch had acted on her own initiative to harm prisoners. The prosecution presented evidence that Koch had continued her cruel behavior even after her husband's arrest in 1943. This evidence was particularly damaging because it showed that her actions were not simply the result of her husband's influence, but reflected her own character and choices. In 1951, the German court found Koch guilty of multiple charges and sentenced her to life imprisonment. The verdict was more comprehensive than the American proceedings and reflected a more thorough examination of her crimes. The German court specifically found that Koch had directly caused the deaths of prisoners through her actions and orders. The sentencing marked what many hoped would be the final chapter in Koch's legal proceedings. However, even while imprisoned, she continued to maintain her innocence of the most serious charges and sought opportunities to appeal her conviction. During her imprisonment, Koch's case continued to attract media attention. Her story became a symbol of Nazi brutality and the complicity of ordinary Germans in the Holocaust. Her case was frequently cited in discussions about collective responsibility and the need for accountability. The German proceedings had established a more complete record of Koch's crimes than the earlier American trial. The evidence presented showed clearly that she had been an active participant in Buchenwald's systematic violence, not merely a bystander to her husband's activities. But even with her conviction and life sentence, Koch's story was far from over. Her years in prison would be marked by continued controversy and her persistent claims of innocence. Aichach Women's Prison in Bavaria became Koch's final home, a stark contrast to the power and luxury she had once enjoyed at Buchenwald. The prison, built in the 19th century, housed female offenders from across Bavaria. For Koch, it represented the complete reversal of her fortunes, from wielding absolute power over thousands to being completely powerless herself. Koch's adjustment to prison life was difficult. Guards reported that she frequently complained about conditions and demanded special treatment based on her previous social status. Her inability to accept her circumstances became a defining characteristic of her imprisonment, reflecting perhaps her continued inability to acknowledge the full extent of her crimes. During her early years in prison, Koch maintained correspondence with supporters who believed she had been wrongly convicted. These supporters, primarily former Nazi sympathizers, argued that she had been made a scapegoat for her husband's crimes and that witness testimony against her was unreliable. This external support may have reinforced her own denial about her actions. Prison records show that Koch struggled with the routine and restrictions of institutional life. She frequently clashed with guards and other inmates, apparently unable to adapt to her powerless position. Her behavior in prison reflected the same arrogance and sense of entitlement that had characterized her time at Buchenwald. As the years passed, however, Koch's external support gradually diminished. Former Nazi sympathizers either died or moved on with their lives, leaving her increasingly isolated. The broader German society was working to confront its Nazi past, making open support for convicted war criminals socially unacceptable. Koch's health began to deteriorate during her imprisonment. Prison medical records indicate that she suffered from various ailments, including depression and anxiety. The psychological impact of her confinement, combined with her advanced age, began to take its toll on her physical condition. Despite her declining health, Koch continued to maintain her innocence of the most serious charges against her. She wrote letters claiming that witness testimony had been fabricated and that physical evidence had been misrepresented. Her persistent denials suggest either genuine delusion or calculated manipulation, even while facing the consequences of her actions. The changing political climate in Germany also affected Koch's situation. As the country worked to establish democratic institutions and confront its Nazi past, war criminals like Koch became symbols of a period that Germans wanted to leave behind. This made any possibility of clemency or early release increasingly unlikely. Koch's case occasionally returned to public attention when journalists or historians wrote about Nazi war criminals. These articles typically portrayed her as an example of how ordinary people could become complicit in systematic violence. Her story served as a warning about the dangers of unchecked power and ideological extremism. In her later years in prison, Koch became increasingly withdrawn and isolated. Guards reported that she spent most of her time alone in her cell, reading or writing letters. Her interactions with other inmates were minimal, possibly due to both her notoriety and her own antisocial behavior. The psychological pressure of imprisonment, combined with her advancing age and declining health, began to affect Koch's mental state. Prison officials noted changes in her behavior and demeanor, suggesting that she was struggling to cope with her circumstances. The woman who had once terrorized thousands now seemed diminished and fragile. As the 1960s progressed, Koch's situation became increasingly desperate. Her appeals had been exhausted, her supporters had largely abandoned her, and her health was failing. The reality of spending the rest of her life in prison apparently began to weigh heavily on her mind. Prison officials who interacted with Koch during this period reported that she seemed increasingly despondent about her future. The woman who had once wielded absolute power now faced the prospect of dying forgotten and reviled in a prison cell. The final months of Koch's life were marked by increasing isolation and despair, setting the stage for the tragic conclusion that would bring her story to its ultimate end. The summer of 1967 marked a turning point in Ilse Koch's psychological state. Prison guards at Aichach began noting significant changes in her behavior and demeanor. The woman who had maintained her defiance for decades seemed to be losing her will to continue fighting her circumstances. Koch's daily routine in prison had become increasingly solitary. She spent most of her time in her cell, emerging only for meals and brief exercise periods. Guards reported that she spoke little to other inmates and seemed lost in her own thoughts much of the time. This withdrawal represented a dramatic change from her earlier years in prison, when she had been more combative and demanding. Medical records from this period indicate that Koch's physical health was declining rapidly. She complained of various ailments and required more frequent medical attention. However, it was her mental state that concerned prison officials most. They noted signs of severe depression and anxiety that seemed to be worsening as the months passed. In her correspondence during this period, Koch's writing revealed a woman struggling with the reality of her situation. Letters to her few remaining contacts showed increasing desperation and hopelessness. She wrote about feeling forgotten by the world and abandoned by those who had once supported her cause. Prison chaplains who attempted to counsel Koch reported that she remained unrepentant about her actions at Buchenwald. She continued to maintain that she had been wrongly convicted and that witness testimony against her had been fabricated. This persistent denial may have prevented her from finding any peace or redemption in her final months. The isolation of prison life was particularly difficult for someone who had once commanded respect and fear from thousands of people. The contrast between her former power and her current powerlessness apparently became increasingly unbearable as she contemplated spending the remainder of her life behind bars. During late August 1967, guards noticed that Koch was becoming even more withdrawn than usual. She barely touched her meals and spent most of her time lying on her bed staring at the ceiling. When spoken to, she responded with single words, or not at all. These behavioral changes prompted prison officials to place her under closer observation. Koch's cell was located in a section of the prison housing long-term inmates. The routine was predictable and unchanging. Meals at set times, brief exercise periods, and long hours of solitude. For someone who had once thrived on power and control, this regimented existence represented the ultimate humiliation. On the evening of August 31st, 1967, Koch appeared to guards to be in particularly low spirits. She had refused her dinner and spent the evening sitting on her bed, staring out the small window of her cell. Guards conducting their evening rounds noted that she seemed distressed, but attributed this to her ongoing mental health struggles. The night shift guards reported nothing unusual during their periodic checks. Koch appeared to be sleeping normally, and there were no disturbances in her section of the prison. The facility's routine continued as it had for months, with no indication of what was to come in the early morning hours. As dawn approached on September 1st, 1967, the prison was quiet, except for the sounds of guards making their morning rounds. It was during this routine check that guards would discover that Ilse Koch's story had reached its final chapter. The events of that morning would bring to a close one of the most notorious cases from the Nazi era, ending the life of a woman whose actions had caused immeasurable suffering to thousands of innocent people. The morning of September 1st, 1967, began like any other at Aichach Women's Prison. Guards began their routine early morning rounds at approximately 6 a.m., checking on inmates and preparing for the day's activities. The prison operated on a strict schedule that had remained unchanged for years, providing predictability in an environment where routine was essential for security. Guard Heinrich Müller, who had worked at Aichach for over a decade, began his inspection of the long-term housing unit where Koch was confined. He had been assigned to this section for several months and was familiar with the inmates housed there. Koch's cell was located near the end of a corridor that housed the prison's most serious offenders. As Mueller approached Koch's cell, he noticed that something seemed different from his usual morning observations. The cell was unusually quiet, and Koch was not visible in her usual position near the small window, where she often sat during the early morning hours. Mueller called out to announce his presence, as was standard protocol, but received no response. Looking through the cell's observation window, Mueller saw Koch's form on her bed, but her position seemed unnatural. She was lying face down, with what appeared to be bed sheets wrapped around her neck. Mueller immediately realized that something was seriously wrong and called for backup assistance. Within minutes, additional guards arrived at the scene. Prison officials quickly determined that Koch was unresponsive and showed no signs of life. Emergency medical personnel were summoned, but their efforts to revive her proved unsuccessful. She was pronounced dead at approximately 7:15 a.m. The discovery sent shockwaves through the prison administration. Koch had been one of their most notorious inmates, and her death would inevitably attract significant media attention. Prison officials immediately began implementing protocols for handling the death of a high-profile prisoner, including securing the cell as a potential crime scene and notifying appropriate authorities. Initial examination of the scene suggested that Koch had taken her own life using bed sheets fashioned into a makeshift noose. She had apparently attached one end to the window bars of her cell and used her own body weight to complete the act. The method was consistent with other similar incidents that had occurred in correctional facilities. Prison officials found no evidence of foul play or external involvement in Koch's death. The cell was secured and had been locked throughout the night, with guards reporting no unusual activity during their periodic checks. Koch's death appeared to be the result of her own actions, carried out in the privacy of her cell during the early morning hours. Among Koch's personal effects, guards found several letters she had written but not sent, expressing her despair about her situation and her belief that she would never be released from prison. These writings provided insight into her mental state during her final days and suggested that she had been contemplating ending her life for some time. The prison chaplain, who had attempted to counsel Koch in recent months, was notified of her death. He reported that she had seemed increasingly despondent during their conversations and had expressed feelings of hopelessness about her future. However, she had never directly threatened to harm herself during their meetings. Medical examination confirmed that Koch had died from asphyxiation, consistent with the evidence found in her cell. The prison physician noted that her declining physical health may have contributed to her psychological distress, creating a combination of factors that led to her final decision. News of Koch's death spread quickly beyond the prison walls. Media outlets across Germany and internationally began reporting on the end of one of the Nazi era's most notorious figures. The circumstances of her death became a subject of public discussion and debate. Prison officials conducted a thorough investigation into the circumstances surrounding Koch's death, examining security procedures and reviewing the actions of guards during the night shift. The investigation concluded that proper protocols had been followed and that the death could not have been prevented given the information available to prison staff. The death of Ilse Koch marked the end of a chapter in the ongoing effort to address Nazi war crimes. Her passing removed one of the last direct links to the systematic violence that had characterized the concentration camp system. With the discovery of Ilse Koch's death in her prison cell, one of history's most notorious figures had reached the end of her story. The woman who had once wielded absolute power over thousands of innocent lives died alone and forgot, a stark contrast to the fear and suffering she had once represented. Koch's death came 22 years after Germany's surrender and the liberation of Buchenwald. During those decades, the world had worked to understand and address the systematic violence of the Nazi era. Her case had served as an important example of how ordinary individuals could become complicit in crimes against humanity when institutional power was combined with ideological extremism. The legal proceedings against Koch had helped establish important precedents for prosecuting war crimes and crimes against humanity. Her trials demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of seeking justice for unprecedented crimes. While legal accountability was achieved, questions about moral responsibility and the prevention of future atrocities remained complex and unresolved. Koch's story also illustrated the corrupting influence of unchecked power. Her transformation from bookkeeper to perpetrator showed how institutional authority could enable individuals to commit acts they might never have imagined possible under different circumstances. This lesson remains relevant for understanding how systematic violence emerges and persists in societies around the world. The testimonies of Buchenwald survivors who testified against Koch provided crucial evidence for her prosecution, but they also served a broader historical purpose. Their accounts helped document the experiences of those who suffered under Nazi rule and ensured that the crimes committed at places like Buchenwald would not be forgotten or denied. These brave individuals, many of whom had endured years of trauma, found the strength to face their tormentor in court and provide testimony that would secure justice. Koch's persistent denial of her crimes, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, reflected a broader pattern among Nazi perpetrators who refused to acknowledge their responsibility. This denial made reconciliation and understanding more difficult, but also demonstrated the importance of thorough documentation and legal proceedings. Her refusal to accept responsibility, even in her final years, serves as a stark reminder that perpetrators often fail to comprehend the full scope of their actions. Her death in prison, while tragic in its own way, represented a form of justice for the thousands who had suffered under her authority. The woman who had caused so much pain and suffering had spent her final years powerless and imprisoned, facing the consequences of her actions. The contrast between her position of absolute power at Buchenwald and her final isolation in a prison cell demonstrates how justice, though sometimes delayed, can ultimately prevail. The media attention that surrounded Koch's death showed that public interest in Nazi war crimes remained strong more than 2 decades after the war's end. Her case continued to serve as a reminder of the importance of vigilance against the forces that had made such crimes possible. Newspapers across Europe and America covered her death, reflecting the lasting impact her crimes had made on the collective memory of the Holocaust. For the survivors of Buchenwald and other Nazi camps, Koch's death marked the passing of someone who had personified the cruelty they had endured. While it could not undo the harm she had caused, it provided a sense that justice had ultimately been served. Many survivors, now elderly themselves, viewed her death as the closing of a painful chapter in their own lives. The broader implications of Koch's case extend far beyond her individual crimes. Her story became part of the larger narrative about how democratic societies must remain vigilant against the emergence of authoritarian movements that dehumanize specific groups. The ease with which she transitioned from ordinary citizen to willing participant in genocide serves as a warning about how quickly civilized society can collapse when proper safeguards are not maintained. Educational institutions around the world have used Koch's case as a teaching tool to help students understand the Holocaust and the broader phenomenon of genocide. Her story provides a concrete example of how individual choices, when multiplied across thousands of people, can result in systematic atrocities. This educational value ensures that her crimes serve a purpose in preventing future genocides. The legal frameworks established during her trials continue to influence international law today. The principles of individual responsibility for crimes against humanity, regardless of orders from superiors, were strengthened through cases like hers. Modern international criminal courts still reference precedents established during the prosecution of Nazi war criminals like Koch. Her case also highlighted the importance of survivor testimony in establishing historical truth. The detailed accounts provided by former Buchenwald prisoners not only secured her conviction, but also created an invaluable historical record. These testimonies became part of the broader effort to document Holocaust experiences and counter-attempts at historical denial. The psychological aspects of Koch's case continue to fascinate researchers studying the origins of evil. Her transformation from an ordinary woman to a perpetrator of atrocities provides insights into how normal people can become complicit in systematic violence. Understanding these psychological mechanisms remains crucial for recognizing and preventing similar situations in contemporary contexts. The international response to Koch's crimes helped establish the principle that certain acts are so heinous that they concern all of humanity, not just the immediate victims. This concept of universal jurisdiction for crimes against humanity emerged partly from cases like hers and continues to shape international legal approaches to mass atrocities. Koch's gender also made her case particularly significant in challenging assumptions about women's roles in violence. Her active participation in systematic brutality, contradicted contemporary stereotypes about women as inherently peaceful or passive. This aspect of her case contributed to a more nuanced understanding of how gender intersects with perpetration of mass violence. The facilities where Koch committed her crimes have since been transformed into memorial sites and museums. Buchenwald concentration camp memorial serves as a place of remembrance for the victims and education for future generations. Visitors can learn about the systematic nature of Nazi crimes and the individual stories of both perpetrators and victims. The legacy of Ilse Koch's crimes serves as a permanent reminder of humanity's capacity for both evil and justice. Her story demonstrates the importance of individual moral responsibility, even within systems that encourage or demand immoral behavior. It also shows how societies can work to establish accountability and prevent similar atrocities from occurring again. Today, Koch's story continues to be studied by historians, legal scholars, and others seeking to understand how systematic violence emerges and how it can be prevented. Her case provides important lessons about the dangers of unchecked authority and the need for institutions that protect human dignity and rights. These lessons remain relevant as contemporary societies grapple with authoritarian movements and human rights violations. The empty cell at Aichach Women's Prison that morning in September 1967 marked not just the end of one woman's life, but the closing of a chapter in humanity's ongoing struggle to confront its darkest impulses and build a more just world. Koch's death represented the final act in a story that began with the corruption of power and ended with the ultimate powerlessness of isolation and despair. Her story serves as both a warning and a source of hope, a warning about how quickly ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary evil, and hope that justice, though sometimes delayed, can ultimately be achieved. The thousands of victims who suffered under her authority were not forgotten, and their suffering was not in vain if it helps prevent similar atrocities in the future. The morning light that revealed Koch's lifeless form in her prison cell also illuminated the enduring truth that individual actions matter, that justice is possible, and that even in humanity's darkest hours, the forces of accountability and remembrance can prevail over those who would inflict suffering on the innocent. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.